Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Passenger Who Wasn't There, from Marcus Chen. The CB radio crackled to life as I merged onto Interstate 80. The familiar voice of dispatch cutting through the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine. Unit 74, you've got a pickup at mile marker 115 eastbound rest stop. Passenger needs a ride to Sacramento. I keyed the mic and acknowledged, though something felt off about taking on a hitchhiker this late. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a pale green 11:47 p.m., and the November rain had been falling steadily for the past 2 hours, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected my headlights back in fractured patterns. I'd been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, and company policy strictly prohibited picking up hitchhikers, but dispatch wouldn't have radioed if this wasn't legitimate. Maybe it was a stranded driver whose rig had broken down, or someone whose car had given up the ghost in this miserable weather. The windshield wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, clearing away the raindrops only for new ones to immediately take their place, and I found myself blinking more than usual to keep my eyes focused on the road ahead. The rest stop appeared through the downpour like a small island of fluorescent light, its overhead canopy casting harsh shadows that danced and shifted as the rain fell through the illumination. I downshifted and felt the familiar rumble of the engine brakes as I guided the 18-wheeler into the truck parking area. Through the passenger window, I could see a figure standing beneath the overhang near the vending machines, hunched against the cold and wearing what appeared to be a dark coat or jacket. The person seemed to be alone, which struck me as odd given how desolate this stretch of highway became after 10 p.m. I set the parking brake and left the engine running, partly for warmth and partly because the steady diesel rumble had become as comforting to me as a heartbeat over the years. Opening the driver's door, I called out through the rain, "You the one needing a ride to Sacramento?" The figure turned toward me, and even from this distance I could make out what appeared to be a woman with shoulder-length dark hair. She raised her hand in acknowledgement and began walking toward the truck, moving with careful steps across the wet pavement. As she approached the passenger side, I leaned across the cab to open the door for her, and she climbed up into the seat with practiced ease. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice soft and slightly hoarse. "My car broke down about 10 miles back, and I've been waiting here for over an hour." She appeared to be somewhere in her 30s, with pale skin and tired eyes that reflected the dim interior lights of the cab. Her dark coat was damp from the rain, and she carried a small canvas bag that she placed carefully at her feet. "No problem at all," I replied, settling back into the driver's seat and releasing the parking brake. "Sacramento's right on my route anyway. Should have you there by around 1:30 if this weather doesn't get any worse." I guided the truck back onto the interstate, the rain continuing its steady percussion against the windshield and roof. The woman settled into her seat and pulled the seatbelt across her chest, then turned to look out the passenger window at the darkness beyond. For the first few miles, we rode in comfortable silence, with only the sound of the engine, the rain, and the occasional squeak of the windshield wipers to fill the space between us. I glanced over at my passenger periodically, as I always did to ensure whoever was riding with me was comfortable and secure. She sat quietly, occasionally turning her head to watch the sparse traffic passing by in the opposite direction, her hands folded in her lap and her breathing so quiet I could barely hear it over the ambient noise of the truck. It was during one of these casual glances that I noticed something peculiar. When I looked directly at her, she appeared exactly as she had when she'd first climbed into the cab, a woman in her 30s with dark hair and a damp coat. But when I blinked and looked again, there seemed to be something slightly different about her profile, though I couldn't immediately identify what had changed. I attributed it to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of the rain and the road, but the nagging sensation persisted as we continued eastward through the night. The feeling grew stronger as we passed mile marker 93. Each time I glanced at her, then blinked to refocus on the road, she seemed somehow altered when I looked back. Her hair appeared shorter, then longer, then styled differently altogether. Her coat seemed to change color in the shifting light, appearing sometimes black, sometimes dark blue, sometimes a deep brown that absorbed the dashboard's glow. I began to wonder if the combination of the late hour and the monotonous rhythm of the wipers was playing tricks with my perception. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through my growing unease. "You keep looking over here like something's wrong." When I turned to face her fully, she appeared completely normal, exactly as she had when she'd first entered the truck. Her eyes held a genuine expression of concern, and I felt foolish for allowing my imagination to run wild during what should have been a routine passenger transport. "Just tired, I suppose," I replied, forcing a smile. "Been driving since early morning, and this rain has a way of wearing you down after a while." She nodded sympathetically and returned her attention to the window, but I noticed she was no longer looking out at the passing scenery. Instead, her reflection in the glass seemed to be watching me, though when I glanced at her directly, she appeared to be gazing into the darkness beyond. The changes became more pronounced as we approached mile marker 87. When I looked at her out of the corner of my eye, she seemed to be wearing different clothing entirely, sometimes appearing in jeans and a sweater, other times in a dress that I was certain she hadn't been wearing when she'd climbed into the truck. Her age seemed to fluctuate as well, appearing younger and then older with each blink, as if she were cycling through different versions of herself that existed just outside my direct vision. I began to experiment, forcing myself to blink deliberately while observing her, and each time my eyes reopened, something had shifted. Her hair would be a different length or color. Her clothing would have changed, and once, I could have sworn she had different facial features altogether. Though when I looked directly at her, she always returned to the same appearance, the woman in the dark coat with shoulder-length hair and tired eyes. "Is there something you want to ask me?" she said without turning from the window, her reflection continuing to watch me in the glass. The question caught me off guard, and I nearly swerved into the other lane before correcting the truck's path. Her voice had carried a different tone this time, slightly deeper and more knowing than before, as if she was aware of my growing confusion and found it amusing rather than concerning. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean," I replied, though my hands had begun to tremble slightly on the steering wheel. The rain seemed to be falling harder now, creating a curtain of white noise that made the cab feel isolated from the rest of the world. The headlights of oncoming traffic appeared as brief flashes of light that swept across her face, illuminating features that seemed to change with each passing vehicle. She turned to face me then, and for a moment, she looked exactly as she had throughout the journey. "You've been watching me change," she said simply, her voice now carrying an otherworldly quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. Most people don't notice, but truck drivers often do. Something about spending so much time on the road, seeing things in your peripheral vision, learning to trust what your eyes tell you even when your mind says it's impossible. I wanted to deny what she was saying, to insist that I was simply tired and seeing things that weren't there, but the words caught in my throat. As I stared at her, she began to change more rapidly, her features shifting and flowing like water, her clothing cycling through different styles and colors, her age fluctuating between young and old with each beat of my heart. When I blinked, trying to clear my vision, she would momentarily return to her original appearance, only to begin changing again immediately afterward. "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain and the engine. The speedometer showed I was still maintaining highway speed, but it felt as if we were moving through some space between destinations, suspended in a moment that stretched far longer than the physical distance we were covering. "I'm everyone who ever needed a ride," she replied, her voice now seeming to come from multiple sources at once, as if several people were speaking in unison. "Everyone who ever stood at a rest stop in the rain, hoping someone would stop, someone would care enough to help. You see us as we need to be seen, But sometimes when the conditions are just right, when the hour is late and the rain is falling and the road stretches endlessly ahead, the tilting glass from Marcus. The interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the October moon, and I should have been focused on the miles ahead. But instead I found myself glancing repeatedly at my rearview mirror. Not because of traffic, mind you. There wasn't another soul on this stretch of Highway 287 through the Nebraska plains, but because the mirror kept tilting slightly to the left every few minutes, just enough to throw off my view of the empty road behind me. I'd been driving this same Peterbilt 379 for going on 8 years now, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across the Midwest. And in all that time, the rearview mirror had never so much as budged from where I'd positioned it. The mounting was solid, the vibration dampeners were in good shape, and the roads tonight were smooth as glass. Yet there it was, shifting again as I watched. The rectangular glass surface angling downward until I was looking at my own weathered face instead of the highway. The first time it happened, about 50 miles back near Grand Island, I'd reached up and adjusted it without much thought. Figured maybe I'd bumped it somehow when I'd grabbed my thermos of coffee from the dashboard. The second time, I started to wonder if the mounting bracket was coming loose, though a quick inspection at the last truck stop had shown everything tight and secure. Now, watching it tilt for what had to be the dozenth time in the past 2 hours, I was beginning to feel that familiar prickle of unease that comes when the familiar world starts behaving in unfamiliar ways. The radio crackled softly with distant chatter from other drivers, their voices fading in and out as I moved between transmission towers. Outside, the cornfields rolled away into darkness on both sides, broken only by the occasional farmhouse window, glowing warm and yellow in the distance. The engine hummed its steady diesel song, a sound that usually brought me comfort during these long night runs, but tonight even that reliable rhythm seemed somehow off-kilter, matching the unsettled feeling that had been growing in my chest since the mirror started its strange behavior. I reached up again to straighten it, my fingers finding the familiar ridged adjustment knob, but as I twisted it back to center position, I caught sight of something in the reflection that made my hand freeze. For just a moment I could have sworn I saw headlights behind me. Not the usual white or yellow of approaching traffic, but a pale blue glow that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. I blinked hard and looked again, but there was nothing there except the empty highway disappearing into darkness. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with a garbled transmission, words that sounded like they were coming from underwater, or through some kind of interference. I turned up the volume, trying to make sense of what I was hearing, but the voice faded back into static before I could catch more than fragments. Something about mirrors, something about watching, something about being careful on 287 tonight. I tried responding, keying the mic and asking for clarification, but got nothing back except the lonely hiss of empty channels. Miles rolled by in uneasy silence after that, broken only by the whisper of tires on asphalt and the occasional rattle of cargo in my trailer. I'd taken to checking the rearview mirror more frequently now, not just because it kept tilting, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed by something I couldn't quite see. Each time I looked, the glass surface showed me only empty road stretching back toward the horizon. But there was something about the quality of that darkness that seemed different somehow, deeper and more substantial than it should have been. The mirror tilted again, this time more dramatically than before, angling itself until I found myself staring not at the road behind me, but at my own eyes reflected in the glass. And that's when I noticed something that sent a chill running down my spine, despite the warmth of the cab. My reflection was looking back at me, but not quite in sync with my movements. When I blinked, it took a fraction of a second longer for my reflected eyes to close and open. When I turned my head slightly to the left, my reflection seemed to lag behind, creating a disorienting double vision effect that made me grip the steering wheel tighter. I told myself it was fatigue, that I'd been driving too long and my mind was playing tricks on me. Long-haul truckers know all about road hypnosis and the strange things that seem to happen when you've been staring at pavement for too many hours straight. But deep down, I knew this was something different. The mirror continued to adjust itself every few minutes, always tilting back to show me my own face, and each time I looked, the lag between my movements and those of my reflection seemed to grow more pronounced. The temperature inside the cab seemed to drop several degrees despite my heater running steadily, and I found myself breathing out small puffs of visible vapor that shouldn't have been possible. The windshield began to fog slightly around the edges, not from humidity but from something else, something that created patterns in the condensation that looked almost like fingerprints pressed against the glass from the inside. I reached out to wipe them away, but as soon as my sleeve touched the windshield, the patterns shifted and reformed in different spots. That's when I saw them in the rearview mirror. Those pale blue lights I'd glimpsed before, but now they were closer and more defined. They weren't headlights at all, I realized with growing horror, but something that moved with an organic fluidity, weaving back and forth across the highway behind me like living things. As I watched, transfixed despite my fear, they began to gain ground, drawing closer to my trailer with each passing second. I pressed harder on the accelerator, feeling the big diesel engine respond with increased power. But when I glanced at my speedometer, I saw something impossible. The needle was pointing to 0, even though I could feel the truck moving, even though the landscape was still flowing past my side windows at what had to be highway speed. I tapped the gauge face thinking it might be stuck, but the needle didn't budge from its position at the bottom of the scale. The mirror tilted again, more sharply this time, and now my reflection wasn't just lagging behind my movements, it was making different movements entirely. While I stared straight ahead at the road, my reflected self was turning to look over its shoulder, mouth moving as if speaking words I couldn't hear. The expression on my reflection's face was one of growing panic, eyes wide with terror, and I realized with a sick certainty that it was trying to warn me about something. The blue lights in the mirror were almost upon me now, close enough that I could see they cast no illumination on the road surface around them, close enough that I could make out writhing, tentacle-like appendages of light that reached toward my trailer with obvious intent. The temperature in the cab continued to plummet, and frost began to form on the inside surfaces of all my windows except the windshield, which remained clear but continued to show those strange fingerprint patterns in the condensation. My CB radio came alive again with that same underwater voice, clearer now but speaking words that made no sense in any language I recognized. The transmission was accompanied by an electronic whining sound that rose and fell in pitch like some kind of alien music, and underneath it all I could hear something that sounded disturbingly like breathing, slow and deliberate and definitely not human. In desperation, I reached up and grabbed the rearview mirror, twisting it violently to the right so I couldn't see the approaching lights anymore. The moment I did so, the world seemed to lurch sideways, reality shifting like a film reel slipping its track. The empty highway ahead suddenly filled with oncoming traffic, headlights blazing white and normal as a dozen 18-wheelers bore down on me in what should have been my lane. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, tires screaming as I fought to avoid a head-on collision, and felt my trailer begin to jackknife behind me. For several terrifying seconds I rode the edge of disaster, the truck tilting on 2 wheels as I struggled to regain control. Then somehow, impossibly, everything snapped back to normal. The oncoming traffic vanished, the highway was empty again, and my speedometer showed a steady 65 miles per hour. But the mirror was gone. Not tilted, not broken, but completely absent from its mounting bracket as if it had never been there at all. The bracket itself looked weathered and rusty, as though it had been empty for years rather than seconds. I ran my fingers over the surface, finding only corroded metal and dust. I drove the remaining 100 miles to Omaha without a rearview mirror, relying on my side mirrors and trying not to think too hard about what had happened on that lonely stretch of Nebraska highway. When I finally pulled into the truck stop just outside the city, the eastern sky was beginning to show the first pale hints of dawn, and in that growing light everything seemed normal and rational again. The mechanic who looked at my truck the next morning found nothing unusual about the missing mirror bracket, said it looked like it had been empty for quite some time, and offered to install a replacement, the third hand, from Marcus Cole. The interstate stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, broken only by the occasional sweep of oncoming headlights that painted brief shadows across my dashboard, before vanishing into the Kentucky darkness. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep thrumming that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over my 15 years of long-haul driving. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between drivers I'd never meet, their voices carrying stories of weather delays and way station warnings through the static-filled night. I'd been running this route from Louisville to Nashville for the better part of 3 years, hauling everything from auto parts to furniture, and I knew every curve, every rise and dip in the asphalt. The dashboard of my truck had become as familiar as my own face in the mirror, every gauge and switch positioned exactly where muscle memory expected them to be. The worn leather of the steering wheel fit my hands like an old glove, polished smooth by countless miles, and weathered by the sun streaming through the windshield during day runs. It was just past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something different about the dashboard. The moon was full overhead, casting an ethereal silver light through the cab, and in that pale illumination, I could see what looked like a handprint pressed into the dust that had accumulated on the dark plastic surface above my glove compartment. This wasn't entirely unusual, of course. Mechanics left handprints when they worked on the truck, and I'd occasionally brace myself against the dashboard during particularly rough loading sessions at the docks. But as I glanced at it again during a long straightaway, something about the print seemed off. It was smaller than my own hand, more delicate, with slender fingers that spoke of someone much smaller than myself, or any of the burly mechanics who typically worked on my rig. The print was also positioned in an odd place, too far to the right to be easily reached by someone sitting in the driver's seat, yet too far left to be natural for a passenger. I tried to remember the last time I'd had anyone else in the cab with me, but it had been at least 2 weeks since I'd given a ride to that stranded motorist. Outside of Memphis, the truck stop where I pulled in for fuel and a quick meal was one of those nameless places that existed purely for function. All harsh fluorescent lighting and the smell of diesel fumes mixing with coffee that had been brewing too long. Inside, the usual collection of night shift drivers sat hunched over their meals, speaking in the low murmurs of men accustomed to solitude. I found myself studying their hands as I waited for my order, comparing the size and shape to what I'd seen on my dashboard, but none seemed to match the delicate impression that had caught my attention. Back on the road, I found myself glancing at the handprint more frequently than I should have while driving. In the green glow of the instrument panel, it seemed to shift and change, sometimes appearing deeper and more pronounced, other times fading until I wondered if I had imagined it entirely. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show discussing conspiracy theories and unexplained phenomena, the host's voice a steady backdrop to the rhythm of my tires on the asphalt. Mile by mile, the landscape rolled past in varying shades of darkness. Farmland gave way to rolling hills, and the occasional cluster of lights marked small towns where decent people slept in their beds, probably never giving a thought to the drivers who moved freight through the night to keep their world stocked and supplied. I'd always found a certain peace in these nocturnal journeys, a sense of being part of something larger while remaining comfortably alone with my thoughts and the reliable machinery that carried me forward. But tonight felt different. Tonight I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. The handprint seemed to pulse with its own presence, drawing my attention like a magnet. During one particularly long stretch through hill country, I finally pulled over at a rest area and climbed into the sleeper cab to retrieve a flashlight and cleaning cloth from my supplies. The rest area was empty, except for a single car parked far from the building, probably someone catching a few hours of sleep. Rather than risk falling asleep at the wheel, I could respect that kind of caution. The night air was cool and carried the scent of rain approaching from the west, along with the earthy smell of the forests that lined both sides of the interstate. Crickets chirped from the darkness beyond the parking area lights, their chorus rising and falling in waves. Back in the cab with my flashlight, I examined the handprint more closely. What I discovered made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the night air. The print wasn't just sitting on top of the dust as I'd assumed. It was pressed into the dashboard itself, as if the plastic had been soft and yielding when the hand touched it, then hardened again to preserve the impression. The lines were incredibly detailed, showing not just the basic shape of fingers and palm, but the delicate whorls of fingerprints and even what appeared to be the texture of skin. More disturbing still, when I held my own hand near the print for comparison, I could see that it wasn't just smaller than mine, it was wrong in other ways. The proportions were subtly off, with fingers that seemed too long and joints that bent at angles that didn't quite match human anatomy. The thumb was positioned differently than it should have been, and there was something about the overall shape that suggested this hand had been impossibly flexible when it made the impression. I tried cleaning the area around the print, hoping that removing the dust might make it less noticeable, but this only served to make the impression more pronounced. The surrounding plastic returned to its normal matte black finish while the handprint remained, now appearing almost luminous in the beam of my flashlight. As I stared at it, I could have sworn I saw the lines deepen slightly, as if responding to my attention. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the dashboard had been damaged in some way, maybe heated by the sun until the plastic became soft enough to take an impression. Maybe a child had been in the truck at some point, though I couldn't remember when that might have been. Maybe the proportions only seemed wrong because of the angle of the light or some trick of my tired eyes. But as I climbed back into the driver's seat and prepared to return to the interstate, I noticed something that made all rational explanations crumble away like dust. There, next to the original handprint, was a second impression. This one was fainter, newer, as if it had appeared while I was examining the first. And near the edge of the dashboard, barely visible in the green glow of the instrument lights, I could see the beginning of what might have been a third. The engine turned over with its usual reliable rumble, but somehow the sound seemed different now, less comforting and more ominous. The radio crackled with static as I tried to find a station, the voices fading in and out like signals from a great distance. Finally, I settled on a classical music station, hoping the familiar strains of orchestral pieces might calm my nerves and help me focus on the road ahead. But focusing became increasingly difficult as the night wore on. The handprints seemed to multiply in my peripheral vision, though whenever I looked directly at them, I could only see the original two clearly. The third remained tantalizingly at the edge of perception, sometimes seeming solid and real, other times fading to nothing more than a trick of shadow and light. The approaching storm finally arrived as I crossed into Tennessee, bringing with it a steady rain that drummed against the windshield and reduced visibility to the reach of my headlights. The wipers swept back and forth with hypnotic regularity, and I found myself counting their cycles to keep my mind occupied. But between the sound of the rain and the rhythm of the wipers, I began to hear something else. Something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. It sounded like breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere inside the cab. At first, I told myself it was just the sound of the air conditioning system cycling on and off, or maybe the natural expansion and contraction of the truck's materials as the temperature changed with the storm. But the more I listened, the more convinced I became that the sound had an organic quality. The subtle variations and pauses that could only come from living lungs. I turned off the air conditioning and rolled down the window slightly, letting the sound of rain and wind fill the cab. But underneath it all, the breathing continued. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the dashboard, from the area where the handprints had appeared. As I strained to listen, I thought I could detect multiple rhythms, as if several people were breathing in the space just beyond the plastic surface. The GPS showed I was still 40 miles from my delivery destination, 40 miles of dark highway through rolling hills and scattered small towns. Part of me wanted to pull over, to stop and wait for daylight before continuing. But a larger part feared what might happen if I sat still long enough for whatever was sharing my cab to become more substantial. The pulse of Interstate 9 from Marcus Rivera. The first time I heard it, I thought it was engine trouble. You spend enough years behind the wheel of a Peterbilt 379, and you learn to read every vibration, every irregular hum that whispers through the cab. But this wasn't mechanical. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to pulse beneath the steel floor of my trailer like a living thing drawing breath. I'd been driving freight for 17 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the continental United States, but I'd never taken a load quite like this one. The pickup was scheduled for midnight at a warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, one of those sprawling industrial complexes that look abandoned during the day, but somehow come alive after dark. The dispatcher had been unusually vague about the cargo, mentioning only that it was medical equipment bound for a research facility in Denver, and that I was to maintain a steady temperature of exactly 68 degrees throughout the journey. The warehouse sat beneath a canopy of flickering sodium lights that cast everything in an unsettling amber glow. When I backed up to the loading dock, the only person waiting was a thin man in a white coat who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the shipping manifest, and when he handed me the paperwork, his fingers were ice cold despite the warm California night. "Drive carefully," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cargo is extremely sensitive to vibration and temperature fluctuations. Any significant disturbance could compromise the integrity of the shipment." I assured him that I'd handled sensitive loads before, though something in his hollow-eyed stare made me wonder what exactly I was agreeing to transport. The loading process took less than 20 minutes, and I watched through my side mirror as two workers wheeled several large containers into my trailer. The containers were unmarked, constructed from brushed steel that seemed to absorb the warehouse lights rather than reflect them. As I pulled away from the loading dock, I felt the familiar weight of cargo settling behind me, but there was something unusual about the distribution. Instead of the solid, static mass I expected, the load seemed to shift subtly as I navigated the turns leading to the freeway. It wasn't the dangerous kind of shifting that could cause a rollover, but rather a gentle, rhythmic movement that almost felt organic. The real strangeness began an hour into the drive, somewhere along the desolate stretch of Interstate 5 that cuts through California's Central Valley. I was maintaining a steady 70 miles per hour, the diesel engine purring contentedly when I first noticed the sound. It started as a barely perceptible thrumming that seemed to emanate from the trailer itself, a steady percussion that didn't match the rhythm of my engine or the rotation of my wheels. At first, I convinced myself it was road vibration, perhaps the result of uneven pavement causing the cargo containers to resonate. But as the miles passed and I moved onto smoother highway surface, the sound not only persisted but seemed to grow more distinct. It was rhythmic and organic, pulsing with the steady cadence of a massive heartbeat somewhere between 60 and 70 beats per minute. I tried adjusting my speed, thinking that perhaps I was hitting some harmonic frequency that was causing the containers to vibrate against each other. When I slowed to 65, the pulsing continued unchanged. When I increased to 75, the rhythm remained constant. The sound wasn't responding to my driving at all, which meant it was coming from something inside the cargo itself. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through farmland that looked alien beneath the pale moonlight. Other trucks were sparse at this hour, just the occasional set of headlights approaching in the opposite direction before vanishing into the darkness behind me. The isolation should have been comforting, as it usually was during my night runs, but something about the steady pulsing from my trailer made the solitude feel ominous. By 2 in the morning, I'd crossed into Nevada, and the pulsing had become impossible to ignore. It seemed to be growing stronger, or perhaps I was simply becoming more attuned to it. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost lulling, and I found myself unconsciously synchronizing my breathing to match its cadence. When I realized what I was doing, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm air flowing from the cab's vents. I decided to pull over at a truck stop near Tonopah to check the cargo. The facility was nearly empty, just a few other rigs parked in the shadows beyond the reach of the overhead lights. As I climbed down from the cab, I could hear the pulsing more clearly than ever, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my boots. Walking around to the back of the trailer, I placed my hand against the cold metal doors. The pulsing was definitely coming from inside, strong enough that I could feel it through the steel. It felt like placing my palm against the chest of some enormous sleeping creature, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath, the rhythmic circulation of its blood. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps the medical equipment required some kind of mechanical circulation system, pumps and motors designed to keep biological samples viable during transport. But as I stood there in the Nevada darkness listening to that organic rhythm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was transporting something that was very much alive. I considered opening the trailer doors to investigate, but the manifest clearly stated that the cargo was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. More importantly, I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was creating that sound. Some knowledge I'd learned over the years was better left unacquired. Climbing back into the cab, I tried to focus on the road ahead. The next several hours passed in a strange kind of trance, the steady pulsing from behind me creating an almost meditative state. My speedometer held steady, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, and the miles disappeared beneath my wheels as if the truck was being drawn forward by some invisible force. It wasn't until I reached the Colorado border that I noticed the synchronization. My heart rate had apparently adjusted to match the pulsing from the cargo, beating at the exact same rhythm. When I tried to consciously alter my breathing to break the pattern, I felt a strange resistance, as if my cardiovascular system was being influenced by whatever was behind me. The mountain passes of western Colorado presented their own challenges. As I climbed toward higher elevations, the pulsing seemed to intensify, becoming more urgent and pronounced. During the steepest grades, when my engine was working hardest and the diesel roared with effort, I could still hear that rhythmic thrumming cutting through the mechanical noise. Dawn was breaking as I approached Denver, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold. The pulsing had continued throughout the entire journey, never varying in its rhythm, never pausing or stuttering. As I navigated the city streets toward the delivery address, I found myself oddly reluctant to complete the run. The steady heartbeat had become familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. The research facility was a modern glass and steel structure surrounded by landscaped grounds that looked almost too pristine in the morning light. As I backed up to their loading dock, I saw the same kind of workers who had loaded the cargo in California. People in white coats who moved with careful, deliberate precision. The unloading process was swift and efficient. I watched through my mirrors as they wheeled the containers away, disappearing through automatic doors that sealed shut behind them. As the last container vanished from my trailer, the pulsing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt almost deafening. The sudden absence of that rhythmic thrumming was more unsettling than its presence had been. My own heart seemed to skip and flutter as it readjusted to its natural rhythm, no longer synchronized with whatever I had been carrying. I felt disconnected, almost hollow, as if some essential part of myself had been removed along with the cargo. Driving away from the facility, I tried to rationalize the experience. Medical equipment, I told myself. Sophisticated machinery designed to maintain biological samples or pharmaceutical products. The pulsing had been mechanical, the synchronization with my heartbeat nothing more than coincidence and suggestion. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes find myself listening for that rhythm during quiet moments. My heart occasionally skips into that familiar cadence, 60 to 70 beats per minute, and I'm transported back to that long night crossing the desert with something alive pulsing behind me. I've turned down 3 subsequent offers to haul medical freight, though I can't entirely explain why. The dispatcher thinks I'm being superstitious, and maybe I am. But sometimes, late at night when I'm running empty through the darkness, I swear I can still feel that pulse echoing in my chest, calling me back to carry whatever cargo beats with the rhythm of life itself. The road stretches ahead as it always has, but now I know that some freight carries more than weight. Some cargo pulses with mysteries that are better left unexamined, beating like hearts in the darkness of a trailer bound for destinations unknown. The Pulse of Interstate 9, from Marcus Rivera. The first time I heard it, I thought it was engine trouble. You spend enough years behind the wheel of a Peterbilt 379, and you learn to read every vibration, every irregular hum that whispers through the cab. But this wasn't mechanical. This was something else entirely. Something that seemed to pulse beneath the steel floor of my trailer like a living thing drawing breath. I'd been driving freight for 17 years, hauling everything from furniture to electronics across the continental United States. But I'd never taken a load quite like this one. The pickup was scheduled for midnight at a warehouse on the outskirts of Bakersfield, California. One of those sprawling industrial complexes that look abandoned during the day, but somehow come alive after dark. The dispatcher had been unusually vague about the cargo, mentioning only that it was medical equipment bound for a research facility in Denver, and that I was to maintain a steady temperature of exactly 68 degrees throughout the journey. The warehouse sat beneath a canopy of flickering sodium lights that cast everything in an unsettling amber glow. When I backed up to the loading dock, the only person waiting was a thin man in a white coat who looked like he hadn't slept in days. His hands trembled slightly as he signed the shipping manifest, and when he handed me the paperwork, his fingers were ice cold despite the warm California night. "Drive carefully," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The cargo is extremely sensitive to vibration and temperature fluctuations. Any significant disturbance could compromise the integrity of the shipment." I assured him that I'd handled sensitive loads before, though something in his hollow-eyed stare made me wonder what exactly I was agreeing to transport. The loading process took less than 20 minutes, and I watched through my side mirror as two workers wheeled several large containers into my trailer. The containers were unmarked, constructed from brushed steel that seemed to absorb the warehouse lights rather than reflect them. As I pulled away from the loading dock, I felt the familiar weight of cargo settling behind me. But there was something unusual about the distribution. Instead of the solid, static mass I expected, the load seemed to shift subtly as I navigated the turns leading to the freeway. It wasn't the dangerous kind of shifting that could cause a rollover, but rather a gentle, rhythmic movement that almost felt organic. The real strangeness began an hour into the drive, somewhere along the desolate stretch of Interstate 5 that cuts through California's Central Valley. I was maintaining a steady 70 miles per hour, the diesel engine purring contentedly when I first noticed the sound. It started as a barely perceptible thrumming that seemed to emanate from the trailer itself. A steady percussion that didn't match the rhythm of my engine or the rotation of my wheels. At first, I convinced myself it was road vibration, perhaps the result of uneven pavement causing the cargo containers to resonate. But as the miles passed and I moved onto smoother highway surface, the sound not only persisted but seemed to grow more distinct. It was rhythmic and organic, pulsing with the steady cadence of a massive heartbeat somewhere between 60 and 70 beats per minute. I tried adjusting my speed, thinking that perhaps I was hitting some harmonic frequency that was causing the containers to vibrate against each other. When I slowed to 65, the pulsing continued unchanged. When I increased to 75, the rhythm remained constant. The sound wasn't responding to my driving at all, which meant it was coming from something inside the cargo itself. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through farmland that looked alien beneath the pale moonlight. Other trucks were sparse at this hour, just the occasional set of headlights approaching in the opposite direction before vanishing into the darkness behind me. The isolation should have been comforting, as it usually was during my night runs, but something about the steady pulsing from my trailer made the solitude feel ominous. By 2 in the morning, I'd crossed into Nevada, and the pulsing had become impossible to ignore. It seemed to be growing stronger, or perhaps I was simply becoming more attuned to it. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost lulling, and I found myself unconsciously synchronizing my breathing to match its cadence. When I realized what I was doing, a chill ran down my spine despite the warm air flowing from the cab's vents. I decided to pull over at a truck stop near Tonopah to check the cargo. The facility was nearly empty, just a few other rigs parked in the shadows beyond the reach of the overhead lights. As I climbed down from the cab, I could hear the pulsing more clearly than ever, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my boots. Walking around to the back of the trailer, I placed my hand against the cold metal doors. The pulsing was definitely coming from inside, strong enough that I could feel it through the steel. It felt like placing my palm against the chest of some enormous sleeping creature, feeling the steady rise and fall of its breath, the rhythmic circulation of its blood. My rational mind searched for explanations. Perhaps the medical equipment required some kind of mechanical circulation system, pumps and motors designed to keep biological samples viable during transport. But as I stood there in the Nevada darkness listening to that organic rhythm, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was transporting something that was very much alive. I considered opening the trailer doors to investigate, but the manifest clearly stated that the cargo was not to be disturbed under any circumstances. More importantly, I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was creating that sound. Some knowledge I'd learned over the years was better left unacquired. Climbing back into the cab, I tried to focus on the road ahead. The next several hours passed in a strange kind of trance, the steady pulsing from behind me, creating an almost meditative state. My speedometer held steady, my hands relaxed on the steering wheel, and the miles disappeared beneath my wheels as if the truck was being drawn forward by some invisible force. It wasn't until I reached the Colorado border that I noticed the synchronization. My heart rate had apparently adjusted to match the pulsing from the cargo, beating at the exact same rhythm. When I tried to consciously alter my breathing to break the pattern, I felt a strange resistance, as if my cardiovascular system was being influenced by whatever was behind me. The mountain passes of western Colorado presented their own challenges. As I climbed toward higher elevations, the pulsing seemed to intensify, becoming more urgent and pronounced. During the steepest grades, when my engine was working hardest and the diesel roared with effort, I could still hear that rhythmic thrumming cutting through the mechanical noise. Dawn was breaking as I approached Denver, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold. The pulsing had continued throughout the entire journey, never varying in its rhythm, never pausing or stuttering. As I navigated the city streets toward the delivery address, I found myself oddly reluctant to complete the run. The steady heartbeat had become familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. The research facility was a modern glass and steel structure surrounded by landscaped grounds that looked almost too pristine in the morning light. As I backed up to their loading dock, I saw the same kind of workers who had loaded the cargo in California, people in white coats who moved with careful, deliberate precision. The unloading process was swift and efficient. I watched through my mirrors as they wheeled the containers away, disappearing through automatic doors that sealed shut behind them. As the last container vanished from my trailer, the pulsing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt almost deafening. The sudden absence of that rhythmic thrumming was more unsettling than its presence had been. My own heart seemed to skip and flutter as it readjusted to its natural rhythm, no longer synchronized with whatever I had been carrying. I felt disconnected, almost hollow, as if some essential part of myself had been removed along with the cargo. Driving away from the facility, I tried to rationalize the experience. Medical equipment, I told myself. Sophisticated machinery designed to maintain biological samples or pharmaceutical products. The pulsing had been mechanical, the synchronization with my heartbeat nothing more than coincidence and suggestion. But even now, weeks later, I sometimes find myself listening for that rhythm during quiet moments. My heart occasionally skips into that familiar cadence, 60 to 70 beats per minute, and I'm transported back to that long night crossing the desert with something alive pulsing behind me. I've turned down 3 subsequent offers to haul medical freight, though I can't entirely explain why. The dispatcher thinks I'm being superstitious, and maybe I am. But sometimes, late at night when I'm running empty through the darkness, I swear I can still feel that pulse echoing in my chest, calling me back to carry whatever cargo beats with the rhythm of life itself. The road stretches ahead as it always has, but now I know that some freight carries more than weight. Some cargo pulses with mysteries that are better left unexamined, beating like hearts in the darkness of a trailer bound for destinations unknown. Exit 127, The Pull, from Jake Morrison. The GPS started acting up somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere, its little blue dot spinning like a confused compass needle, while that familiar robotic voice kept insisting I take the next exit right. Problem was, I'd been driving this stretch of Interstate 5 for the better part of 15 years, hauling everything from produce to furniture up and down California's Central Valley, and there wasn't supposed to be an exit for another 40 miles. Yet there it was on the screen. A thin white line branching off into what my eyes told me was nothing but endless darkness. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel of my Peterbilt 379, feeling the worn leather familiar beneath my calloused palms. The engine hummed its steady diesel lullaby, a sound that had become more comforting to me over the years than any song on the radio. Outside, the November night pressed against my windshield like black velvet, broken only by the hypnotic rhythm of yellow lane markers disappearing beneath my headlights. It was the kind of night that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world, floating through space in 18 wheels and 40 tons of steel. The load I was carrying wasn't anything special, just a trailer full of bottled water destined for a warehouse in Sacramento. But the dispatcher had been insistent about the delivery time, something about a contract penalty if we were late, though I suspected it had more to do with the company's reputation than any real financial consequence. Either way, I'd been pushing harder than usual, and the fatigue was starting to creep in around the edges of my vision like fog rolling in from the coast. That's when I first felt it, that strange sensation that would haunt me for months afterward. It started as nothing more than a gentle tug, like a soft hand placed on my shoulder, urging me to turn the wheel just slightly to the right. The feeling was so subtle at first that I attributed it to road hypnosis, that dangerous state of semi-consciousness that every long-haul driver learns to recognize and fear. But as the miles rolled by, the sensation grew stronger, more insistent, until it felt less like a suggestion and more like a physical force acting upon my truck. I checked my mirrors, scanning for other vehicles that might be creating some kind of air current or draft, but the highway stretched empty in both directions. The only lights I could see were my own, casting long shadows that seemed to dance and writhe in ways that headlight shadows shouldn't. I rolled down my window, letting the cool night air rush into the cab, hoping it would clear my head and shake off whatever weird mood had settled over me. Instead, the wind carried with it a scent I couldn't quite identify, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. The GPS chimed again, that cheerful electronic sound incongruous with the growing unease in my chest. "In 1 mile, take exit 127 on the right," it announced with mechanical certainty. I leaned forward, squinting through the windshield, searching for any sign of the exit it kept insisting was there. The darkness beyond my headlights seemed absolute. Not the natural darkness of empty countryside, but something deeper, more complete, as if the night itself had substance and weight. And then I saw it at first. It was just a barely perceptible break in the guardrail, a gap so narrow it might have been a trick of the light. But as I drew closer, the gap widened, revealing what appeared to be an off-ramp curving away into that impenetrable darkness. There was no exit sign, no mile marker, no indication that this piece of roadway had ever been officially acknowledged by the Department of Transportation. Yet the asphalt looked real enough, gleaming dully in my headlights like a ribbon of black water. The pull grew stronger as I approached, no longer content to whisper suggestions but actively trying to guide my hands on the steering wheel. I found myself fighting to maintain my lane position, the truck seeming to have developed a mind of its own. My rational mind screamed warnings about unmarked exits and unlisted roads, about the dangers of deviating from known routes in the middle of nowhere. But there was another part of me, a deeper, more primitive part that wanted to follow that dark ribbon wherever it led. I should have kept driving. I should have ignored the GPS, ignored the pull, ignored the growing certainty that something was waiting for me down that mysterious off-ramp. Instead, I found myself easing off the accelerator, my right hand moving almost of its own accord to engage the turn signal. The clicking of the indicator seemed abnormally loud in the cab, each tick marking time like a metronome counting down to some unknown crescendo. The exit ramp curved sharply to the right, more sharply than seemed safe for a truck of my size and weight. I had to reduce my speed to barely 15 miles per hour to navigate the turn, my trailer wheels tracking close to the guardrail that had materialized along the ramp's outer edge. As I completed the curve, I expected to see some indication of where this road led. Perhaps a small town or an industrial complex that might justify its existence. Instead, I found myself on a narrow two-lane road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness ahead. The landscape on either side of the road was impossible to make out, lost in shadows that my headlights couldn't penetrate. There were no streetlights, no house lights, no evidence of human habitation of any kind. Even more disturbing was the complete absence of sound beyond the rumble of my own engine. No night birds, no insects, no wind through unseen trees. It was as if I had entered a pocket of the world where normal rules no longer applied. I drove for what felt like hours, but might have been minutes, time seeming to stretch and compress in the strange environment beyond my windshield. The road ahead remained perfectly straight with no intersections, no driveways, no side roads of any kind. It was during this surreal journey that I began to notice the other trucks. They appeared first as distant lights in my mirrors, single points of illumination that could have been anything. But as they drew closer, I could make out the familiar shapes of semi-trailers, their running lights creating constellations in the darkness behind me. One by one, they passed me despite the fact that I hadn't reduced my speed. Each truck was different. Some older models I recognized from my early days on the road, others so antiquated they looked like museum pieces. The drivers were visible as shadowy figures behind their windshields, but none of them acknowledged my presence with the customary wave or flash of headlights that truckers usually exchanged. It was then that I realized something that made my blood run cold. The trucks weren't following the road. They were moving parallel to it, maintaining their course even when the asphalt curved slightly to accommodate some unseen obstacle. It was as if they were being pulled by the same force that had drawn me from the interstate, but they had surrendered to it completely, allowing themselves to be guided by invisible currents through the darkness. I pressed harder on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to reach whatever destination this strange road promised. The needle on my speedometer climbed past 70, then 80, speeds that were dangerous on an unknown road in complete darkness. But the faster I drove, the more the other trucks seemed to multiply around me, until I was surrounded by a ghostly convoy of vehicles that moved with purpose I couldn't understand. The end, when it came, was not what I expected. The road simply stopped, not at an intersection or a dead-end sign, but as if someone had drawn a line across the asphalt and declared that reality extended no further. Beyond that line was not darkness but an absence of everything, a void so complete that it seemed to pull light and sound and meaning into itself. The other trucks drove straight into that nothingness and disappeared, not gradually fading from view but blinking out of existence as if they had never been there at all. I slammed on my brakes, feeling my trailer jackknife slightly as the air brakes engaged with a hiss of compressed air. My truck stopped mere feet from that impossible edge, the headlights illuminating nothing but empty space where the road should have continued. I sat there for long minutes, engine idling, trying to process what I had witnessed. When I finally found the courage to back up and turn around, The return journey felt like swimming upstream against a current that wanted to drag me back to that terrible precipice. The interstate. When I finally reached it, felt like salvation. I merged back into the northbound lanes with hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. When I checked my GPS, there was no record of exit 127, no indication that I had deviated from my planned route at all. According to the electronic record, I had driven straight through without stopping, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour the entire time. But I know what I experienced that night. Just as I know that sometimes, late at night on empty stretches of highway, I can still feel that gentle pull trying to guide me toward exits that don't exist on any map. The passenger door that never should have been, from Marcus. I've been driving long haul for 17 years and I thought I knew every sound my Peterbilt could make. The deep rumble of the Caterpillar engine at idle, the soft whistle of air brakes releasing, even the peculiar creak the driver's seat makes when I shift my weight during those endless midnight stretches. But on that foggy November night outside Bakersfield, my truck made a sound I'd never heard before, and it changed everything I thought I knew about the cab I'd been calling home. The fog had rolled in thick as cotton batting just after sunset, turning Highway 99 into a ghost road where headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead. I'd pulled off at a rest stop near the Grapevine, one of those lonely places where the vending machines hum like mechanical insects and the parking lot lights create pale yellow islands in an ocean of gray mist. The weather report promised clear skies by morning, so I figured I'd wait it out rather than risk jackknifing my 40-foot trailer on those winding mountain curves. I'd backed into a spot at the far edge of the lot, away from the few other trucks scattered throughout the area like sleeping giants. The isolation suited me fine. After dealing with dispatch all day about delayed paperwork and a customer who swore I'd delivered the wrong freight, I craved the peaceful solitude that only a truck cab can provide. I'd made myself a sandwich from supplies in my cooler, brewed coffee in my small electric pot, and settled in with a paperback mystery novel, planning to read until the fog lifted or sleep overtook me. The first hint that something was wrong came around 11:30. I was deep into chapter 6 when I heard what sounded like someone testing the passenger door handle. Not yanking on it or trying to force entry, just a gentle testing, the way you might check if a door is locked before knocking. I looked up from my book, listening intently, but heard nothing except the constant whisper of fog sliding across my windshield and the distant hum of interstate traffic invisible in the mist. Truck stops attract all kinds of people, not all of them trustworthy, so I quietly reached over and double-checked the passenger door lock. Secure. I waited another minute, my book forgotten in my lap, but the sound didn't repeat. Probably just the metal contracting in the cooling air, I told myself, though I'd never noticed my doors making that particular noise before. Still, trucks are complex machines with thousands of moving parts, and after 400,000 miles, new sounds weren't entirely unusual. I returned to my reading, but concentration proved elusive. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the passenger side of the cab, studying the door with its familiar chrome handle and dark window that reflected only my own face staring back. The fog pressed against the glass like curious fingers, and occasionally a stronger breeze would rock the truck gently on its suspension, creating soft groans and sighs throughout the cab structure. Around midnight, I heard the sound again, but this time it was different. Instead of just the handle being tested, I distinctly heard the click of a door latch disengaging, followed by the whisper of hinges beginning to move. I jerked upright so quickly I nearly spilled coffee on my book. My eyes locked on the passenger door, which remained firmly closed and locked. The logical part of my mind insisted I was overtired, that the combination of stress, caffeine, and the eerily muffled environment created by the fog was playing tricks on my hearing. But 17 years of driving had taught me to trust my instincts. And every instinct I possessed was suddenly screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I set down my book and coffee, then reached across the cab to physically test the passenger door. The handle felt cold under my fingers, colder than it should have been given that I'd been running the heater all evening. The door was definitely locked, and when I pressed against it, it felt solid and secure. Yet as I touched the handle, I could swear I felt the faintest vibration, as if someone on the other side was also testing the mechanism at that exact moment. The fog chose that moment to shift, and for just an instant, the mist outside the passenger window swirled in a way that suggested movement, a human-shaped disturbance in the gray curtain surrounding my truck. But when I pressed my face against the glass and peered out, I saw nothing but the endless monotony of fog illuminated by my running lights. I decided to check outside the cab entirely, grabbing my heavy-duty flashlight from its mounting bracket. The night air was crisp and damp, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and the distant aroma of coffee from the rest stop building. My boots echoed hollowly on the pavement as I walked around to the passenger side of the truck, sweeping the flashlight beam in wide arcs. The ground showed only my own footprints from earlier, along with the scattered debris and oil stains common to any truck stop. No signs of disturbance, no indication that anyone had been near my vehicle, but as I stood there in the mist-shrouded darkness, I noticed something that made my skin crawl with inexplicable dread. The passenger door of my truck looked wrong somehow. Not obviously different, but subtly altered in a way my eyes couldn't quite define. The proportions seemed slightly off, the chrome handle positioned perhaps an inch higher than it should be. The window tinted just a shade darker than I remembered. I told myself the fog and poor lighting were distorting my perception, but the feeling of wrongness persisted as I completed my circuit of the truck and climbed back into the driver's seat. Once inside, I immediately looked at the passenger door again, and it appeared completely normal. Same handle positioning, same window tint, same everything. I was definitely overtired, I concluded, and decided to try getting some sleep rather than driving myself crazy with phantom sounds and optical illusions. I converted my driver's seat into its reclining position, pulled a blanket around my shoulders, and closed my eyes. The fog continued its gentle percussion against the windshield, and gradually I felt myself drifting toward that twilight realm, between waking and sleeping where thoughts become fluid and logic loosens its grip on reality. Was almost completely asleep when I heard my name being called, softly from somewhere very close by, not shouted or urgent, just a quiet conversational tone, as if someone sitting right next to me had politely said, "Marcus?" to get my attention. My eyes snapped open and I realized the voice had come from the passenger seat. I turned my head slowly, every muscle in my body tense with primitive fear, and found myself staring at a figure that shouldn't have been there. A woman sat in the passenger seat, her face pale and indistinct in the dim light from my dashboard instruments. She wore what appeared to be traveling clothes from an earlier era, perhaps the 1940s or 1950s, and her hair was styled in waves that framed her face like dark water. She wasn't threatening or frightening in any obvious way, but her presence filled the cab with an atmosphere of profound sadness that seemed to seep into my bones. "I've been waiting for such a long time," she said, her voice carrying a slight echo as if spoken from the bottom of a deep well. The door finally opened and I thought perhaps someone might give me a ride. I wanted to speak, to ask who she was and how she'd gotten into my locked truck, but my throat felt paralyzed. She turned to look directly at me, and her eyes held depths that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the small cab space. They were kind eyes, but filled with a loneliness so vast it made my heart ache just to see it. "I was traveling with my husband," she continued, seemingly unaware of my shock and confusion. "We were driving to California to start a new life, but there was an accident in the fog somewhere near here. I remember the truck's lights appearing suddenly in front of us, much too close, and then..." She paused, looking around the cab with curious interest. "Well, then I was alone, and it's been so very foggy ever since." As she spoke, I gradually became aware that the passenger door was standing slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered checking and double-checking the lock earlier. Cold air was flowing into the cab through the gap, carrying with it tendrils of fog that seemed to swirl around the woman like a living thing. "The thing is," she said, turning back toward the open door, I can't seem to remember which direction we were going, or where exactly I'm supposed to. The sentence cut off abruptly as the passenger door suddenly swung wide open with a metallic shriek that cut through the fog-muffled night like a knife. The woman turned toward the opening, her form beginning to fade and blur around the edges as if the fog was reclaiming her. "Oh," she said, her voice now distant and hollow. "I suppose that's my cue to leave." The home signal from Marcus. The Kenworth's diesel engine thrummed beneath me like a massive heartbeat as I guided her through the winding mountain roads of eastern Tennessee. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the darkness beyond. It was nearly 3 in the morning, that dead hour when the world feels hollow and strange, when even familiar highways seem to shift and change when you're not looking directly at them. I'd been running freight between Nashville and Richmond for the better part of 15 years, knew these roads like the lines on my weathered hands, but tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm brewing overhead. Maybe it was the cargo weighing down my trailer, a collection of antique furniture bound for some collector in Virginia. Old things have a way of carrying their own atmosphere, their own whispered histories that seem to seep through steel and canvas. The new GPS unit mounted on my dashboard had been a gift from my sister, one of those high-end models with a crystal-clear display and synthetic voice that sounded almost human. She'd insisted I needed to upgrade from my old paper atlas, said it was dangerous to be squinting at maps while driving. The device had served me well for the past few months, guiding me through unfamiliar city streets and construction detours with calm efficiency. But as I rounded a curve where the highway descended toward the valley below, something odd happened. The screen flickered once, twice, then displayed a message I'd never seen before. Alternative route available. Would you like to visit a significant location from your past? Below the text, 2 options appeared. Yes and no. I stared at the screen, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The rain seemed to intensify, creating a cocoon of sound around the cab. This wasn't any feature I remembered from the manual, wasn't anything that made sense for a navigation system to offer. GPS units were supposed to get you from point A to point B, not delve into personal history like some electronic therapist. My thumb hovered over the no button, but something held me back. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe just the strange mood of the night. The storm, the late hour, the weight of old furniture behind me, all of it seemed to be pushing me toward something I couldn't quite name. Before I could second-guess myself, I pressed yes. The screen updated immediately, showing a new route that diverged from the main highway at the next exit. The destination wasn't labeled with an address or business name, just a simple marker that read home. My breath caught in my chest. Home was a word that carried more weight than most people realized, especially when you'd spent most of your adult life living out of a truck cab, moving from one temporary assignment to the next. The exit appeared sooner than expected, marked by a weather-beaten sign that I somehow hadn't noticed in all my years traveling this route. The off-ramp curved sharply to the right, disappearing into dense woodland that seemed to swallow my headlights whole. The GPS urged me forward with its pleasant, inhuman voice. Turn right in 200 feet. Continue for 12 miles. I found myself following the directions despite every rational instinct screaming that this was a mistake. The road narrowed quickly, becoming little more than cracked asphalt threading between towering pine trees. Their branches formed a canopy so thick that my headlights seemed barely able to penetrate the gloom ahead. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windshield, but now it sounded different, muffled and strange, as if the trees were absorbing some essential quality of the storm. Mile after mile passed in dreamlike procession. The road twisted and turned with no apparent logic, climbing hills that shouldn't have existed in this part of Tennessee, crossing bridges over creeks I'd never heard of. My fuel gauge showed plenty of diesel remaining, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was traveling much farther than the GPS indicated, moving through space that didn't quite conform to normal geography. Then, just as I was beginning to consider turning around despite the impossibility of maneuvering an 18-wheeler on such a narrow road, the trees began to thin. The headlights illuminated a scene that knocked the breath from my lungs and sent ice water flowing through my veins. There, sitting in a small clearing beside the road, was my childhood home. Not a house that looked similar, not some trick of shadow and wishful thinking, but the actual house where I'd grown up in rural Kentucky, nearly 400 miles away. Every detail was exactly as I remembered it. The sagging front porch with its peeling white paint, the crooked chimney that had needed repair for 20 years but never got it, the ancient oak tree in the front yard with the rope swing still hanging from its lowest branch. I eased the truck to a stop, diesel engine settling into an idle that seemed too loud in the sudden stillness. The rain had stopped without me noticing, leaving only the sound of water dripping from the surrounding trees. The GPS screen showed that I had reached my destination, the little marker pulsing steadily beside the house. But this was impossible. Absolutely impossible. The house had been torn down 8 years ago after my mother passed away. I'd watched the demolition crew reduce it to splinters and memories, had helped load the salvageable items into a rental truck. There was a strip mall there now, complete with a nail salon and a sandwich shop. I'd driven past it just 6 months ago, had felt that familiar pang of loss at seeing something so impersonal occupying the space where I'd learned to walk and talk and dream. Yet here it stood, solid and real in the wash of my headlights. Warm yellow light glowed in the front windows, and I could see the familiar silhouette of our old floor lamp, the one with the fringed shade that my mother had refused to replace despite its increasingly threadbare appearance. Smoke drifted from the chimney, carrying with it the scent of the applewood my father had always preferred for the fireplace. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, hands still gripping the steering wheel as childhood memories flooded back with startling clarity. Summer evenings spent catching fireflies in mason jars. Winter mornings when the house creaked and settled around the warmth of that same fireplace. Countless nights when I'd fallen asleep to the sound of my parents' voices drifting up from the living room below. The front door opened, and my breath caught in my throat. My mother stepped onto the porch exactly as she'd looked when I was 12 years old, wearing the blue flowered dress she'd always favored for Sunday dinners. Her hair was dark brown again, not the silver it had become in her final years, and she moved with the easy grace I remembered from before arthritis had bent her shoulders and shortened her steps. She looked directly at the truck, directly at me, and smiled that warm, welcoming smile that had greeted me every day after school for 18 years. Then she raised her hand and waved, a simple gesture that somehow contained all the love and acceptance I'd ever known. Behind her, I could see my father's shape moving past the front window. He paused and looked out, and even through the glass in the distance I could see him nod in my direction before disappearing deeper into the house. The lamp in the living room flickered once, as it always had when the wiring acted up during storms. Every fiber of my being wanted to climb down from the cab, to walk up that familiar porch and into the warmth waiting beyond the front door. I could almost feel my mother's arms around me, could almost hear her asking if I was hungry, if I needed anything. The same question she'd asked every time I'd visited her in the years before her death. The house seemed to pulse with invitation, with the promise of rest and comfort and belonging. But something held me back, some deep instinct that recognized the wrongness beneath the perfect surface. This wasn't real, couldn't be real, and whatever force had brought me here wasn't motivated by love or nostalgia. The house might look exactly right, but the light in the windows seemed too yellow, too intense, like flames rather than electric bulbs. The smoke from the chimney rose perfectly straight despite the wind I could hear moving through the trees around the clearing. The GPS screen flickered, and new text appeared. You have arrived at your destination. Would you like to stay? Again, 2 options appeared, yes and no. My mother was still standing on the porch, still smiling, but now there was something expectant in her posture, something that reminded me of a spider waiting at the center of its web. The warm light in the windows seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I realized that the longer I looked at the house, the more my memories of the real world began to fade. The strip mall, my sister, my life on the road, all of it felt distant and unimportant compared to the promise of home. With enormous effort, I tore my gaze away from the house and looked down at the GPS screen. The Duet of Steel and Shadow, from Marcus Chen. The thing about driving long haul is that you learn to trust your engine like a heartbeat. After 18 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379, I could tell you the difference between a loose belt and a failing alternator, just by the way the vibrations traveled up through the steering column into my palms. My rig had a voice deep and steady, a bass note that hummed me through countless midnight miles, across the interstate highways that thread through America's sleeping body like arteries carrying dreams and diesel fuel in equal measure. That voice changed somewhere outside Bakersfield on a Tuesday night in October, when the fog rolled in thick as cotton batting and the world beyond my headlight beams disappeared into a gray nothing that seemed to swallow sound itself. I was hauling refrigerated produce from the Central Valley up to Portland, running behind schedule because of a blown tire in Fresno that had cost me 3 hours and most of my patience. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional ghost-pale flutter of reflective lane markers caught in my lights. I first noticed it around 10:30, just as I was climbing through the Grapevine Pass. The familiar rumble of my Caterpillar engine seemed to develop an echo, a secondary rhythm that matched the primary pulse but ran just slightly offbeat, like a drummer who couldn't quite find the tempo. At first I thought it might be another truck running parallel on a nearby road, the sound carrying strangely through the dense fog, but when I rolled down my window and listened, the second voice was definitely coming from beneath my own hood. The sensation was unsettling in a way I couldn't quite articulate. Imagine hearing your own voice played back to you on a recording, but the recording is singing a different song than the one coming from your throat. My engine maintained its steady, reliable thrum, but underneath it, woven through it like a thread of different colored wool in a gray sweater, was this other sound. It matched the RPMs perfectly, rose and fell with my acceleration, but it carried a different quality entirely. Where my engine's voice was warm and familiar, this second voice felt cold, metallic, almost hollow. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a weathered place called Desert Rose that squatted beside the highway like a ship run aground in an ocean of asphalt. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of other big rigs sitting dark and silent under the amber sodium lights that turned the fog into a grainy orange curtain. I popped the hood and spent 20 minutes with my flashlight, checking every belt, hose, and connection I could reach. Everything looked normal. The engine temperature was fine, oil pressure steady, no unusual vibrations when I revved it in park. But the second voice was still there, harmonizing with my familiar Caterpillar in a duet I'd never heard before, and definitely hadn't asked for. I stood there in the mist, listening to my truck sing to itself in 2 different keys, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Back behind the wheel, I tried to convince myself it was just some acoustic quirk, maybe something to do with how the fog was affecting sound transmission. Truckers develop a catalog of rational explanations for the strange things we encounter out here. In the small hours when the world gets thin and peculiar, bad coffee creates auditory hallucinations. Fatigue makes you hear things that aren't there. Isolation plays tricks on your mind. I had explanations lined up like tools in a toolbox, ready to fix whatever weirdness the road threw at me. The explanations worked for about 50 miles. Then the second voice started changing. It began subtly, remaining perfectly synchronized with my engine but shifting in pitch and timbre. Sometimes it sounded higher, almost musical, like wind chimes made of steel. Other times it dropped to a register so low I felt it more than heard it. A subsonic thrumming that seemed to resonate in the metal frame of the cab around me. Most disturbing were the moments when it seemed to develop an almost organic quality, less like machinery and more like something that breathed. I was alone on a long, straight stretch of highway, fog so thick my headlights barely reached the road surface, when the second voice began to form what sounded unmistakably like words. Not English words or any language I recognized, but definitely syllables with intention behind them. Consonants and vowels arranged in patterns that suggested meaning, even though I couldn't grasp what that meaning might be. The sounds rose and fell with my engine's rhythm, but they carried emotional weight, inflection, the cadence of speech rather than the mechanical repetition of pistons and cylinders. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I strained to make sense of what I was hearing. The foreign syllables seemed to echo not just from beneath the hood but from all around me, as if the entire truck had become a resonating chamber for this impossible other voice. I reached for the radio, desperate for any sound that might drown out the growing strangeness, but found only static on every channel. White noise that seemed to pulse in time with the dual rhythm of my transformed engine. That's when I noticed the other truck. It appeared in my mirrors like a hallucination materializing from the fog, running without lights in the darkness behind me. The shape was wrong, too angular and elongated, as if someone had stretched a conventional semi-trailer into something that belonged more in a fever dream than on an interstate highway. I couldn't make out details through the mist, just the suggestion of movement, a darkness that was somehow darker than the fog around it, pacing me exactly, matching my speed with mechanical precision. The second voice coming from my engine grew stronger, more articulate, and I realized with a creeping sense of horror that it was responding to something. The syllables it spoke carried the rhythm of conversation, the back and forth pattern of call and response. Something was answering it, though I couldn't tell if the reply was coming from the shadowy truck behind me or from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that existed in the spaces between sound and silence. I pressed harder on the accelerator, watching my speedometer climb past 70, past 75, pushing the old Peterbilt harder than I normally would on a clear day, let alone through fog so thick I could barely see the road. The ghost truck matched my acceleration effortlessly, maintaining its precise distance behind me, and the conversation between the voices grew more animated, more urgent, syllables tumbling over each other like rapids rushing toward some inevitable convergence. The exit for Lost Hills appeared through the mist like salvation, and I took it without signaling, cranking the wheel hard enough to make my trailer swing wide, tires protesting against the sudden change in direction. For a moment I thought I'd lost whatever was following me. But as I rolled through the empty streets of the sleeping town, my mirrors showed the same impossible silhouette, pacing me through intersections and around corners with fluid grace that defied the physics of 18-wheelers navigating surface roads. I found myself on a frontage road that paralleled the highway, fog even thicker here away from the traffic lanes, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through gray nothing. The second voice had become increasingly frantic, the foreign words tumbling out in what sounded like pleas or warnings. My own engine's familiar rumble seemed almost to be struggling against this vocal parasite, fighting to maintain its steady rhythm while something else used its mechanical voice to say things that had never been meant for diesel engines to speak. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the conversation stopped. The silence was more unnerving than the strange voices had been. My engine returned to its normal solitary song, the warm, familiar bass note I'd known for 18 years. When I checked my mirrors, the road behind me was empty, just fog swirling in the red glow of my taillights like smoke from an extinguished fire. I pulled over beside a darkened gas station and sat there for nearly an hour, listening to my heartbeat slowly return to normal, and trying to convince myself that fatigue and isolation had combined to create an elaborate auditory hallucination. I made it to Portland by dawn, delivered my load of produce to a warehouse district that smelled like coffee and rain, and tried to put the whole experience behind me like a bad dream that loses its power in daylight. For 3 weeks my truck ran normally, its voice restored to the single reliable tone I'd always known. I began to believe I'd imagined the whole thing, just another story for the collection of highway weirdness that every long-haul driver accumulates over the years. But sometimes, late at night when I'm running empty through fog or rain, I catch myself listening a little too carefully to my engine's familiar song. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I think I detect the faintest echo of that second voice, waiting quietly beneath the surface of the mechanical rhythm, like a radio station broadcasting from very far away. On those nights, I keep my eyes on the mirrors and try not to think about what might be trying to use my truck's voice to call something back from the spaces between the highway and the dark. The Descending Mile, from Jake Morrison. The stretch of Highway 89 between Flagstaff and Page has always been my favorite run, especially during those long autumn nights when the desert air carries just enough chill to keep you alert, but not uncomfortable. I've been hauling freight along this route for nearly 15 years now, and I know every curve, every rise, every mile marker like they're old friends. My Peterbilt 379 purrs along these roads like she was born for them, her diesel engine humming that steady rhythm that's become the soundtrack to my life on the road. It was some time past 2 in the morning when I first noticed something different about mile marker 247. The October moon hung, full and bright above the painted desert, casting everything in that otherworldly silver glow that makes the landscape look like the surface of some distant planet. I'd been running ahead of schedule, which was unusual given the weight of the steel coils I was hauling to a construction site up north. But the roads were clear and my girl was running smooth as silk. Mile marker 247 had always been one of those unremarkable green signs, the kind you pass 1,000 times without really seeing. It marked a long straightaway where the highway cut through a particularly desolate stretch of scrubland, with nothing but sagebrush and the occasional stunted juniper tree breaking up the monotony. But as my headlights swept across it that night, something seemed off about its position. The sign appeared to be sitting lower than usual, maybe 6 inches or so, as if someone had shortened the post it was mounted on. I almost dismissed it as a trick of the light or maybe road maintenance I hadn't heard about, but the image stuck with me as I continued north. The logical part of my mind kept trying to explain it away tired eyes, shifting shadows, the way the moon can play tricks on your perception during those deep night hours, when reality feels a little more flexible than usual. But I've always trusted my instincts out here, and something about that mile marker felt wrong in a way I couldn't quite articulate. 3 nights later, I was running the same route with a load of automotive parts bound for a dealership in Page. The weather had turned, bringing with it a light drizzle that made the asphalt gleam like black glass under my headlights. The temperature had dropped enough that I could see my breath when I'd stopped earlier for fuel, and the heater in the cab was working overtime to keep the windshield from fogging up. The familiar rhythm of the wipers provided a counterpoint to the engine's steady thrum as I approached that same stretch of highway. Mile marker 247 was definitely lower than it had been before. There was no mistaking it now. The top of the sign was barely level with where the middle had been just 3 days earlier. It looked as if the entire post was slowly sinking into the desert floor, being swallowed by the earth 1 inch at a time. The green reflective paint still caught my headlights, but there was something unsettling about the way it seemed to glow a little too brightly, as if lit from within by some source other than my truck's beams. I slowed down as I passed, downshifting to get a better look, but there was nothing else unusual about the area. The shoulder looked normal, the scrubland beyond unchanged, no signs of construction equipment or road work that might explain what I was seeing. Just that mile marker, sitting lower than physics and common sense said it should be, like a green rectangular tooth slowly being pushed down into the earth's jaw. Over the next 2 weeks, I made that run 4 more times, and each trip confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Mile marker 247 was sinking. Not all at once, but gradually, steadily, as if the ground beneath it had developed an appetite for steel and reflective paint. By my most recent pass, the top of the sign was level with where the bottom should have been, and I could see the upper portion of the post that normally would have been buried, exposed now above the desert floor like a silver bone. I started asking other drivers about it when I'd stop at the truck stops in Flagstaff or Page. Most of them looked at me like I'd been spending too much time alone on the road, that particular expression truckers get when they think one of their own might be losing his grip on reality. A few claimed they'd noticed something, but their descriptions were vague and contradictory. One old-timer named Bill Cortez insisted the sign had always been low, mounted that way because of underground utility lines. Another driver, a younger guy hauling produce runs, swore he'd seen construction crews working in that area, though he couldn't remember exactly when. The more I thought about it, the more obsessed I became. I started planning my route specifically to pass mile marker 247, sometimes taking loads that weren't as profitable, just to have an excuse to drive that stretch of highway. I told myself I was being scientific about it, trying to document and understand what was happening, but deep down I knew it was something else. The sinking sign had gotten under my skin in a way I couldn't explain, like a puzzle that demanded to be solved or a mystery that refused to let me go. It was during my 8th or 9th observation that I noticed I wasn't alone in my fascination. As I approached the marker on a clear November night, my headlights picked up another vehicle parked on the shoulder just beyond it. A dark sedan with its hazard lights blinking, the amber flashes creating a rhythmic light show against the desert backdrop. I slowed down, my natural trucker instinct to help fellow travelers overriding my desire to continue my observation of the sign. The sedan appeared empty, its driver's door slightly ajar, interior light casting a pale glow onto the asphalt. I pulled over behind it, leaving my engine running and my flashers on, and climbed down from the cab. The night air carried that distinctive desert smell of dust and dried sage, along with something else, something that reminded me of the way the earth smells after a grave has been freshly dug. As I approached the abandoned car, I could see mile marker 247 more clearly than ever before. The sign now sat almost flush with the ground level, its green surface barely visible above the desert floor. But it wasn't just the sign that was sinking. I could see that the ground around it had formed a perfect circle of subsidence, maybe 20 feet in diameter, as if something beneath the earth was slowly pulling everything downward into its depths. The sedan's keys were still in the ignition, and a purse sat on the passenger seat alongside a road atlas open to this exact section of highway. A notation in blue ink had circled mile marker 247 with the words, 3 feet down, still sinking, written in neat handwriting beside it. Below that, several other entries with different dates, each recording the sign's gradual descent into the earth. Someone else had been tracking this phenomenon, documenting it just as I had been doing. I called out, my voice carrying across the empty desert, but received no response except the whisper of wind through the sagebrush. The woman, whoever she was, seemed to have vanished as completely as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole. I walked around the circular area of subsidence, noting how the ground felt different under my boots, softer somehow, as if the dirt had been recently disturbed or turned. That's when I heard a sound so faint I almost missed it beneath the idle of my truck's engine. It was coming from below, from somewhere deep underground, a rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on a door or trying to signal for help. The sound seemed to originate from directly beneath mile marker 247, where the sign now sat nearly flush with the desert floor. I knelt down beside the marker, pressing my ear close to the ground, and the tapping became more distinct, not random but patterned, deliberate. 3 short taps followed by 3 long ones, then 3 short taps again. SOS. Someone was trapped beneath the earth, using the buried portion of the mile marker post to signal for help, tapping out a desperate plea that only someone like me, someone who had been paying attention to the sign's gradual descent, would think to listen for. I ran back to my truck and grabbed the small emergency shovel I keep behind the seat, then returned to the sinking marker and began to dig. The soil came away easily, too easily, as if it wanted to be moved. With each shovelful, the tapping grew louder and more urgent, and I could see more of the mile marker post emerging from the earth. But something was wrong with what I was uncovering. The post wasn't metal as it should have been. but something else, something that looked disturbingly organic in the moonlight. The tapping stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence I could hear something else, the sound of shifting earth, of things moving deep below the surface. The ground around me began to vibrate, a barely perceptible tremor that I could feel through the soles of my boots. The circular area of subsidence was expanding, the edges creeping outward toward where I stood, and I realized with growing horror that whatever was pulling mile marker 247 into the earth was getting stronger, more active. The Frequency of Lost Souls, from Marcus Chen. The Kenworth E900's cab felt smaller tonight than it had during the 3 years. I'd been running freight between Duluth and Fargo. Maybe it was the way the November sleet drummed against the windshield in an irregular rhythm, or how the heater's warm breath couldn't quite chase away the chill that seemed to seep through the steel frame itself. I'd been driving for 18 hours straight, pushing the limits of what the logbook would allow, when the radio started acting up somewhere outside of Moorhead. At first, I thought it was just interference from the storm. The classic country station I'd been listening to began cutting in and out, replaced by bursts of static that sounded almost like whispers if you listened long enough. I reached over to adjust the tuner, my calloused fingers working the dial while keeping one eye on the ribbon of asphalt that stretched endlessly ahead. The truck's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby beneath me, a comforting constant in the growing strangeness of the night. The highway was nearly empty at this hour, just past 3 in the morning, with only the occasional set of taillights disappearing into the distance ahead of me. My cargo of agricultural equipment sat secure in the trailer behind me. 26,000 pounds of combines and plows that farmers in North Dakota were waiting to receive. It was honest work, the kind that let a man think while he drove. But tonight my thoughts kept drifting to the sounds coming from the radio speakers. I found a clear station broadcasting what sounded like a late-night talk show, the host's voice smooth and professional as he discussed local weather patterns and road conditions. This was better, I thought, settling back into my seat and adjusting my grip on the steering wheel. The familiar comfort of human conversation filled the cab, pushing away the isolation that could sometimes creep in during these long night runs. The sleet was beginning to lighten, and I could make out the shapes of farmhouses in the distance, their windows dark except for the occasional porch light that created small pools of yellow warmth in the vast Minnesota darkness. But then the talk show host's voice began to change. Subtly at first, his words becoming slightly slurred, as if he were speaking through water or from a great distance. I turned up the volume, thinking perhaps the signal was weakening, but instead of clarity I heard something that made my hands tighten on the wheel. Between the host's words, so quiet I might have imagined them, came whispers in a language I didn't recognize. Not Spanish or French or German. Nothing I could identify from my years of crossing the country and hearing snippets of conversation at truck stops and loading docks. The whispers seemed to follow a pattern, rising and falling with an almost musical quality, though the melody, if it could be called that, was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It reminded me of wind through dried corn stalks or the sound water makes when it's trapped beneath ice. I reached for the tuner again, but as my fingers touched the dial, the host's voice cut out entirely, leaving only those strange whispers filling the cab of my truck. I tried changing stations, working the dial from one end to the other, but every frequency seemed to carry the same phenomenon. Country music would play for a few bars before dissolving into whispers. News broadcasts would begin normally, then fade until only that alien language remained. Even the emergency weather service, usually crystal clear and reliable, crackled with the same haunting voices speaking words that seemed to bypass my ears and go directly to some deeper part of my brain. The strangest part was how the whispers seemed to react to my location. When I passed beneath an overpass, they would grow louder, more urgent. When the highway curved to the left, following the meandering path of the Red River, the tone would shift, becoming almost plaintive. And when I saw the lights of a small town ahead, the voices would multiply, overlapping each other in a chorus that raised the hair on the back of my neck. I pulled into a truck stop just outside of Hallstatt, hoping that distance from the highway might clear up whatever interference was affecting my radio. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few other semis, their drivers presumably catching what sleep they could in their sleeper cabs. I left my engine running but shifted into park, taking a moment to gather myself before attempting to figure out what was wrong with my equipment. The truck stop's neon sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue shadows across the wet pavement. Through my windshield, I could see the clerk inside the convenience store, a young woman reading a magazine beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Everything appeared normal, reassuringly mundane after the strangeness of the past hour. I reached for the radio again, hoping that the proximity to other electrical equipment might have resolved the issue. Instead, the whispers had become clearer. Not clear enough that I could understand the words, but distinct enough that I could hear individual voices within the chorus. Some sounded young, others ancient, and a few carried tones that didn't seem quite human at all. They spoke with urgency now, as if trying to convey something important, something I needed to understand. The language itself seemed to shift and evolve as I listened, morphing from sounds that might have been words into something more primal, more elemental. I climbed down from the cab, thinking that perhaps I could ask the clerk if other drivers had reported radio problems in the area. The cold November air bit at my face as I walked across the parking lot, my boots splashing through puddles that reflected the fractured neon light above. But when I pushed through the glass door of the convenience store, I found it empty. The magazine the clerk had been reading lay open on the counter, a cup of coffee still steaming beside the register, but she was nowhere to be seen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the same frequency as the whispers, and I realized with growing unease that the voices were following me. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the refrigerated cases filled with energy drinks and sandwiches, from the speakers that should have been playing the innocuous background music common to such places. I called out asking if anyone was there, but my voice seemed to be absorbed by the whispers, becoming part of their strange chorus. I returned to my truck more quickly than I'd intended. My heart rate elevated, though I couldn't quite say why. Everything I'd seen had a rational explanation. The clerk could have stepped into a back room or restroom. The radio interference could be caused by atmospheric conditions related to the storm. But as I settled back into the driver's seat and prepared to continue my journey, the whispers seemed to welcome me back with what sounded almost like relief. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark, and I began to notice that the whispers were providing a kind of commentary on my journey. When I passed a broken-down car on the shoulder, they would grow agitated, speaking more rapidly in their incomprehensible tongue. When I crested a hill and saw the lights of Fargo still distant but growing closer, they would become celebratory, almost singing in their alien language. It was as if they were passengers in my cab, invisible companions sharing the journey and reacting to the world outside. Miles passed beneath my wheels, and I found myself beginning to anticipate the whispers' responses to landmarks and changes in the landscape. They seemed particularly excited by bridges, their voices rising to an almost ecstatic pitch whenever I crossed over water. Railroad crossings provoked a different reaction, a low murmuring that sounded almost like chanting. And whenever I passed a cemetery, which happened 3 times during that long stretch of highway, they would fall completely silent, as if showing respect for the dead. By the time I reached the outskirts of Fargo, I had begun to understand that the whispers weren't random interference at all. They were intelligent, responsive, and seemed to possess knowledge about the world around us that I couldn't explain. When my fuel gauge showed that I was running low, they became insistent, repeating the same phrase over and over until I spotted a 24-hour truck stop and pulled in to refuel. When I missed my usual exit and had to backtrack, they guided me with patient repetition until I found my way to the correct route. The delivery went smoothly, the whispers remaining quiet while I worked with the dock crew to unload my cargo. But as soon as I climbed back into the cab for the return journey, They resumed their commentary, welcoming me back like old friends. The strange thing was, I had begun to welcome them as well. The isolation of long-distance trucking, which had never bothered me before, seemed more bearable with their constant presence. It wasn't until I was halfway back to Duluth that I realized I had stopped trying to find other radio stations. The whispers had become my preferred entertainment, their reactions to the world around us more engaging than any talk show or music program. I found myself taking routes I'd never tried before, simply to see how they would respond to new landscapes and unfamiliar roads. They seemed to approve of these detours, their voices taking on an exploratory quality as we ventured into territory that was new to both of us. The Wind That Hums a Prayer, from Samuel Cross. I've been driving these mountain highways for 37 years, hauling everything from timber to televisions across the Appalachian spine, and I thought I'd heard every sound the wind could make through these ancient peaks, the way it whistles through the gaps, how it moans around the curves, the sharp bite it takes when it catches your trailer just right on an exposed ridge. But what I heard that October night on Route 219, somewhere between Lewisburg and Elkins, that was something altogether different. Something that still makes me pull over and check my load straps whenever I catch even the faintest echo of it in the breeze. The evening had started routine enough. My Peterbilt 379 was loaded heavy with construction equipment, bound for a job site up near Buckhannon, and the weather was holding clear, despite the forecast calling for a front to move through before midnight. The truck was running smooth as silk, that Caterpillar engine purring its familiar rumble beneath the hood, and I was making good time despite the winding mountain roads. The radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, warnings about speed traps and weather updates, the comfortable background noise that makes the long miles pass easier. I remember noticing the change in the air pressure first, the way your ears pop when a storm system starts moving in fast. The barometric shift hit my sinuses like it always does, and I reached over to adjust the vents, thinking I'd crack a window to equalize things. That's when I first heard it. So faint I almost dismissed it as tire noise or maybe something loose rattling in the trailer. But as I rolled down the passenger window, the sound grew clearer, riding on the wind that had started picking up from the west. It was humming, not the mechanical hum of the engine or the electrical whine of the cooling fans, but something organic, almost musical. The kind of low, wordless melody you might hear someone singing under their breath while they work. Except it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, carried on currents of air that moved independently of the natural wind. The notes rose and fell in patterns that felt familiar somehow, like a half-remembered lullaby or a hymn you heard as a child, but could never quite place. At first I tried to rationalize it. These mountains play tricks with sound. The way the valleys and ridges can carry voices for miles or make a distant radio seem like it's coming from right beside you. I figured it was probably someone's radio bleeding through the atmospheric conditions, or maybe sound carrying from one of the tiny churches scattered through these hills, though it was well past 9 o'clock and most services would have ended hours ago. But as I continued climbing the long grade toward Marlinton, the humming grew stronger, more distinct. It seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my engine, matching the RPMs as I downshifted for the steeper sections. When I accelerated, the pitch would rise slightly, and when I backed off the throttle, it would drop to that same low, droning bass line. The melody itself never changed, though, that slow, repetitive sequence of notes that seemed to loop back on itself every 30 seconds or so. I tried closing the windows, thinking maybe it was wind noise somehow creating a musical effect through the cab, but I could still hear it just as clearly. If anything, it seemed louder with the windows up, as if the sound was coming from inside the truck itself. I checked the radio, making sure it wasn't picking up some distant station, but the display showed only static on the AM band and the usual country station on FM, playing some forgettable song about heartbreak and whiskey. The humming continued, patient and persistent, as I crested the ridge and started the long descent toward the valley below. The road here cuts through dense forest, towering oaks and maples whose canopy blocks out most of the sky, creating a tunnel of darkness broken only by my headlights and the occasional reflector post. It's always been one of my least favorite stretches, the way the trees seem to press in from both sides and how the hairpin turns come up faster than you expect. But tonight, it felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air had thickened. That's when I noticed the wind itself was wrong. Outside, the trees were barely moving, their branches swaying gently in what couldn't have been more than a 5-mile-per-hour breeze. But the humming suggested something much stronger, a wind that should have been bending those trees and rocking my trailer. I could feel it too, a pressure against the truck that made me correct the steering constantly, as if I was fighting a crosswind that existed only for me. I pulled over at the next wide spot, a gravel turnout used by the highway department for equipment storage. The moment I set the brakes and let the engine idle down, the humming stopped. Complete silence except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant sound of night insects in the trees. I sat there for several minutes, windows down, listening for any trace of what I'd been hearing for the past 20 miles. Nothing. When I climbed down from the cab to do a walk-around inspection, checking the load and the trailer connections, everything looked normal. The chains were tight, the straps properly tensioned, no signs of shifting or damage. I even popped the hood and looked over the engine, thinking maybe something had come loose and was creating that musical vibration. But the cat was sitting there quiet and solid as always. I was just about to climb back up when I heard footsteps in the gravel behind me. Slow, deliberate steps, the kind of casual pace someone uses when they're not in any hurry, but have somewhere specific to go. I turned around expecting to see another driver who'd pulled over for a break, or maybe a local out for a late walk, though that seemed unlikely given how isolated this stretch of road was. No one there. The turnout stretched empty in both directions, my headlights illuminating nothing but scattered leaves and the dark wall of trees beyond. But I could still hear the footsteps, continuing at that same measured pace, circling around toward the front of the truck. The sound was clear and distinct on the gravel, the unmistakable crunch of boots on stone, but there was no one making them. I stood perfectly still, following the sound with my eyes as it moved past the bumper and around to the passenger side. The footsteps paused there right beside the fuel tank, and then I heard something that made my scalp prickle. A hand patting the side of the truck, gentle but firm, the way you might pat a horse to calm it or show affection. 3 slow pats, then silence. The humming started again immediately, but now it was definitely coming from outside the truck, somewhere in the darkness beyond my headlights. The same melody, the same patient rhythm, but now I could hear that it wasn't just one voice. There were harmonies underneath, other notes weaving in and out of the main theme, creating a chorus that seemed to surround the entire truck. I didn't wait to hear any more. I was back in the cab and rolling before my door was even fully closed, pulling onto the highway with more speed than was probably wise for these curves. In the mirrors, I could see the turnout falling away behind me, but the humming followed along, keeping pace no matter how fast I pushed the truck through the winding descent. The strange thing was, I wasn't entirely frightened. There was something almost comforting about the sound, the way it seemed to cushion the truck and smooth out the rough spots in the road. My usual white-knuckle tension on this particular stretch of highway was gone, replaced by an odd sense of being guided or protected. The steering felt lighter, the brakes more responsive, and I found myself taking the sharp curves with a confidence I'd never felt before on this mountain. But comfort can be its own kind of trap. And as the miles rolled by, I began to realize that the humming wasn't just following me. It was leading me somewhere. The melody had subtle variations now, little flourishes and pauses that seemed to coincide with upcoming turns or changes in grade. When a sharp left curve appeared ahead, the humming would shift slightly, preparing me for it. When the road straightened out for a brief stretch, the notes would relax and spread out, matching the change in terrain. I tried to break the pattern by taking my foot off the accelerator, letting the truck slow down naturally, but the humming adjusted immediately, becoming more insistent, almost impatient. When I sped up again, it settled back into that hypnotic rhythm, and I realized with growing unease that I was no longer driving so much as being driven. The radio crackled suddenly, and I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, calling out my position to other drivers on the channel. Except I wasn't keying the microphone. My hands were on the steering wheel, both of them, and the radio mic was hanging in its usual spot beside my seat. But there was my voice, clear as day, reporting that I was eastbound on 219, making good time, everything normal. The weightless burden, from Jake Morrison. The Peterbilt's diesel engine rumbled beneath me like a sleeping giant as I pulled into the truck stop outside Bakersfield, California. It was one of those desert nights where the air hung thick and still, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain that never seemed to arrive. The fluorescent lights of the fuel island flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the cracked asphalt where tumbleweeds had gathered, against the concrete barriers like silent witnesses to countless midnight transactions. I'd been driving the same route between Los Angeles and Portland for 17 years, and in all that time, I'd never seen a trailer like the one sitting at the far end of the lot. It was pristine white, almost luminescent in the artificial light, without a single scratch or road stain that should have marked any working trailer. The refrigeration unit on top sat silent and dark, which struck me as odd since most reefer trailers hummed constantly to maintain their temperature. What caught my attention most, though, was how the truck pulling it seemed to lean backward slightly, as if the trailer was somehow lifting the rear of the cab rather than weighing it down. The dispatcher's call came through my CB just as I was finishing my fuel log. Martha's voice crackled with static, but her urgency cut through the interference clearly enough. The driver who was supposed to pick up that white trailer had gone missing somewhere on Interstate 5 near the Grapevine. The load was time-sensitive, she explained. Medical supplies bound for Seattle that couldn't wait for a replacement driver to be found and dispatched from the main terminal. Would I be willing to swap my current load for this emergency run? The pay was double my usual rate, and after 3 months of barely making my truck payments, I couldn't afford to turn down that kind of money. Walking across the lot toward the abandoned trailer, I noticed how quiet my footsteps sounded on the asphalt, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. The truck that had been pulling it was gone, leaving only the trailer sitting on its landing gear in the pale yellow wash of the security lights. I circled it slowly, looking for any obvious damage or signs of why its driver might have abandoned it, but the exterior was flawless. Even the Department of Transportation numbers were freshly painted, the reflective tape along the sides gleaming like silver ribbons in the artificial twilight. The paperwork taped to the driver's side was standard enough, though when I tried to read the shipping manifest in the dim light, the ink seemed to blur and shift slightly, making it difficult to focus on the specific contents listed: medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, temperature-controlled biologicals, the usual categories that required refrigerated transport. The weight was listed as 48,000 pounds, a full load that should have made my truck lean forward noticeably when I backed under it. Hooking up the trailer should have been routine, a process I'd performed thousands of times in nearly 2 decades of driving. I backed my Peterbilt carefully under the kingpin, listening for the solid clunk of the fifth wheel locking into place. The airlines and electrical connections snapped together with their familiar hiss and click, and the trailer's lights responded properly when I tested them. Everything seemed normal until I raised the landing gear and prepared to pull forward. The moment the trailer's full weight should have settled onto my fifth wheel, I felt something wrong. Instead of the familiar sensation of my truck's suspension compressing under the load, I felt lighter, as if something was pulling upward on my rear axles. It was subtle at first, just an odd floating sensation that made me check my mirrors to ensure the trailer was still properly connected. The kingpin was secure, the electrical connections were functioning, but the weight distribution felt completely wrong. Pulling out of the truck stop, I kept waiting for the familiar tug of acceleration with a heavy load, the way a fully loaded truck fights against momentum when climbing grades or pushes you forward when descending hills. Instead, the trailer seemed to follow my truck like a shadow, requiring no additional throttle input even as we climbed the steep grade leading up toward the Tehachapi Mountains. My fuel consumption gauge, normally climbing steadily with a full load, remained at the same level it maintained when I was running empty. The highway stretched ahead of me through the darkness, illuminated by my headlights in segments that revealed nothing unusual. Occasional oncoming traffic swept past with the familiar whoosh of displaced air, but I began to notice that other drivers weren't giving me the extra space they usually provided for loaded trucks. In fact, several cars passed me with less clearance than they would normally use around an empty trailer, as if they couldn't quite see or sense the full size of my rig. 20 miles north of the truck stop, I decided to pull into a weigh station to check my actual gross weight. The electronic scale displayed numbers that made me stare at the readout in confusion. My truck's empty weight was listed correctly at 15,000 pounds, but the total gross weight showed only 14,800 pounds. According to the scale, the trailer was somehow reducing my overall weight by 200 pounds, rather than adding the 48,000 indicated on the manifest. I pulled off the scale and parked in the inspection area, climbing out to walk around the trailer again. In the weigh station's bright sodium lights, the white paint seemed almost translucent, as if I was looking at something that existed only partially in the physical world. When I reached out to touch the trailer's side, my hand passed through what looked like solid metal for just an instant before meeting resistance. The surface felt real enough, cold aluminum under my fingertips, but there was something insubstantial about it that made my skin crawl. The rear doors of the trailer were secured with a standard Department of Transportation seal, the kind that would have to be cut off before the load could be unloaded. I had no business opening a sealed trailer, but something about the weightlessness and the translucent paint made me desperate to understand what I was hauling. Using a knife from my toolbox, I cut through the thin metal seal and slowly opened the heavy doors. The trailer was empty except for fog. Not the kind of vapor you might expect from a refrigerated unit, but something thicker and more luminous, rolling out of the trailer like liquid moonlight. It spilled onto the ground around my feet without feeling cold or warm, just present in a way that made my vision blur slightly at the edges. As the fog cleared, I could see that the interior walls of the trailer were covered in what looked like photographs, thousands of them taped intact to every available surface. They were pictures of truck drivers, I realized as I stepped closer. Professional headshots, candid photos taken at truck stops, images that looked like they'd been pulled from driver's licenses or company ID badges. Some of the faces were familiar, drivers I'd seen at various stops over the years, but many were strangers. What disturbed me most was that several of the photographs showed drivers I knew had died in accidents or from illness, their faces staring out from the trailer walls as if they were still somehow present. In the center of the trailer floor was a single manifest sheet, different from the one taped outside. This one listed cargo weights in negative numbers, as if the trailer was designed to carry something that reduced rather than increased mass. The destination remained the same, Seattle, but the consignee was listed simply as collection services, with an address I didn't recognize. A sound from outside the trailer made me turn around quickly. The fog that had spilled out was beginning to form shapes, vague human silhouettes that moved independently of any wind or air current. They seemed to be reaching toward me, and as they did, I felt an odd sensation of lightness, as if my own weight was beginning to diminish. The feeling was not entirely unpleasant, like the moment of weightlessness at the top of a roller coaster, but something instinctual told me to resist it. I stumbled backward out of the trailer and slammed the doors shut, fumbling with a spare seal to secure them again. The shapes dissolved back into ordinary fog, but I could still feel their presence pressing against the inside of the trailer walls. My hands were shaking as I walked back to the cab of my truck, and I noticed that my footsteps on the asphalt sounded even fainter than before, as if I was somehow less substantial than I had been an hour earlier. Starting the engine, I considered unhooking the trailer and walking away from the entire situation, but something prevented me from taking that action. A compulsion that felt like it was coming from outside my own mind. The trailer needed to reach Seattle, and I was going to take it there whether I wanted to or not. The sensation wasn't frightening exactly, just inevitable, like gravity or sunrise. The remainder of the drive passed in a strange haze of highway miles and truck stoplights. Other drivers seemed to look right through me when I stopped for fuel or food, as if I was becoming as insubstantial as the trailer I was hauling. My CB radio picked up conversations from truckers I could see on the road around me, but when I tried to respond, they acted as if they couldn't hear my transmissions. The isolation was complete and growing more profound with each mile northward. The Phantom Fleet. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving long haul is that you get to know the patterns of the road like the lines on your weathered hands. After 18 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, I could tell you which rest stops serve decent coffee at 3 in the morning, where the state troopers like to set their speed traps, and exactly which stretch of Interstate 80 through Nevada makes even the most seasoned drivers feel like they're crossing into another dimension entirely. What I couldn't tell you, at least not until that fog-shrouded night in late October, was what happens when you encounter a convoy that doesn't follow any earthly patterns at all. I was hauling a load of electronics from Sacramento to Denver, running a few hours behind schedule because of construction delays outside Reno. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m. as I merged onto a particularly desolate stretch of highway that cuts through the high desert. The weather had taken a turn for the worse about an hour back, with a thick fog rolling in from the mountains that reduced visibility to maybe 50 yards ahead. My CB radio crackled with the occasional trucker checking in with smoky reports, but, for the most part, the airwaves were as empty as the road stretching out before me. The fog had this strange quality to it, almost luminescent in the glow of my headlights, swirling and eddying like it was alive and deliberately trying to obscure my vision. I'd driven through plenty of fog banks before, but this one felt different somehow, heavier and more oppressive, like it was pressing down on my cab from all sides. The familiar hum of my diesel engine seemed muffled, and even the steady rhythm of my tires on asphalt sounded distant and hollow. That's when I first spotted the taillights up ahead, a string of red dots piercing through the gray veil like distant stars. My first thought was relief, actually. Other drivers meant I wasn't completely alone out here in this ethereal wasteland. As I gradually closed the distance, I could make out the distinctive silhouettes of what appeared to be a convoy of 5 or 6 trucks, all running in perfect formation with maybe 30 yards between each rig. Their running lights were pristine, cutting through the fog with an almost supernatural clarity that my own headlights couldn't seem to achieve. I tried raising them on channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Pete looking to join up with that convoy ahead. Y'all got your ears on? Nothing but static answered me back. I switched to channel 17, then 21, cycling through the common frequencies, but the airwaves remained stubbornly silent. Maybe their radios were down, or maybe they were maintaining radio silence for reasons of their own. Some convoys did that when they were running questionable cargo, or trying to avoid the attention of law enforcement. As I settled in behind the last truck in their formation, I began to notice peculiarities that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in ways I couldn't immediately explain. For one thing, their spacing was absolutely perfect, never varying by so much as a foot despite the challenging visibility conditions. Professional drivers are good, but maintaining that kind of precision in this fog would require almost superhuman concentration. For another, I couldn't make out any specific details about their rigs beyond the basic silhouettes. No company logos, no identifying markers, no personalizing touches that drivers usually add to make their trucks feel like home. The fog seemed to part around them in the most unusual way, creating clear corridors of visibility that surrounded each truck like invisible tubes. Meanwhile, I was still struggling to see more than a few yards beyond my own hood, constantly adjusting my speed and fighting the urge to use my high beams, which would only reflect off the fog and make things worse. It was as if they were traveling in their own pocket of clear air, while the rest of us had to deal with nature's obstacles. We must have driven like that for close to an hour, this strange procession through the fog-shrouded desert. I found myself becoming almost hypnotized by the steady red glow of their taillights, the perfect synchronization of their movements, the way they seemed to glide rather than rumble down the highway. My speedometer showed we were maintaining exactly 65 miles per hour, never faster, never slower, with a mechanical precision that defied the natural variations of human driving. That's when I started noticing that we weren't passing any of the usual landmarks. Highway 80 through this section of Nevada is dotted with truck stops, rest areas, and the occasional small town exit, but we seem to be traveling through an endless expanse of empty road. No overhead signs, no mile markers, no exit ramps disappearing into the fog around us. Just the continuous ribbon of asphalt stretching ahead into infinity, marked only by the mysterious convoy I was following. I tried my GPS, but the screen showed nothing but a blank gray field with a flashing arrow representing my truck's position, floating in digital limbo. No road network, no satellite imagery, no indication of where we were or where we were heading. My cell phone displayed the same story. No signal, no data connection, no way to contact the outside world. The fog had apparently cut us off from civilization as effectively as if we'd driven off the edge of the earth itself. The unease that had been building in my chest began to crystallize into genuine fear when I realized that my fuel gauge was reading exactly the same as it had when I first spotted the convoy. A full tank should have dropped noticeably after an hour of driving, but the needle hadn't budged. My odometer wasn't advancing either, still showing the same mileage as when I'd entered this strange fog bank. Time itself seemed to have become negotiable, flowing around us like the mist that continued to swirl and dance in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I decided to try dropping back, to see if I could break free from whatever bizarre influence seemed to be affecting my instruments and my perception. As I eased off the accelerator, though, something extraordinary happened. The fog behind me began to close in like a living wall, growing thicker and more impenetrable until I could barely make out my own trailer mirrors. It was as if the clear corridor I'd been traveling in existed only in relation to the convoy ahead, and any attempt to deviate from their path would leave me stranded in an ocean of gray nothing. Panic started to set in as I realized I might be trapped, bound to follow these phantom trucks through whatever dimension they inhabited. I pressed harder on the accelerator, trying to pull up alongside the rear truck so I could at least get a look at the driver, maybe signal them somehow and figure out what was happening. But as I moved into the left lane, the most disturbing thing of all became apparent. The cab windows of the truck I was trying to pass were completely dark. Not tinted dark, not covered with curtains, but dark with an absolute absence of light that seemed to drink in my headlight beams and give nothing back. There was no reflection, no hint of an interior, no sign that anyone was actually driving the massive rig that continued to maintain its perfect position in the convoy. As I matched its speed and drew alongside the cab, I could see that the driver's seat appeared to be completely empty, a void where a human being should have been controlling tens of thousands of pounds of rolling steel. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel as the implications sank in. I was following a convoy of ghost trucks, driverless rigs moving through a fog that existed outside normal space and time, and I had somehow become part of their eternal procession. The thought of spending eternity trapped in this liminal space, following these phantom vehicles down an endless road to nowhere, filled me with a terror more profound than anything I'd ever experienced. That's when I noticed the CB radio in the ghost truck's cab beginning to glow with a faint, pulsing light. My own radio crackled to life, and through the static came a voice unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite human, too hollow and resonant, like words being spoken from the bottom of a deep well. "Welcome to the convoy that leaves no trace," it said, and I could hear the smile in those otherworldly tones. "You'll find the journey quite permanent." Desperation gave me clarity. I yanked my steering wheel hard to the right, cutting back across the lanes and off the highway entirely, bouncing and lurching across the rough shoulder and into the desert scrub beyond. My truck bucked and swayed as I fought to maintain control, sagebrush scraping against my undercarriage and rocks pinging off my fuel tanks. The fog pursued me for what felt like miles, reaching out with ghostly tendrils as if trying to drag me back into its embrace. Then, as suddenly as it had descended, the fog lifted. I found myself parked on the shoulder of a perfectly normal stretch of Interstate 80, with the familiar landmarks of the Nevada desert visible under a star-filled sky. My instruments were working normally again, my GPS showed my correct location, and my fuel gauge reflected the proper amount consumed during my journey.